The ground collapsed beneath Grace Holloway before she could take another step. Within seconds, the former U.S. Army combat engineer was trapped beneath an abandoned mine in Montana, her leg pinned under a rotting timber as freezing rain poured into the darkness. Above her, 3 German shepherds were her only chance of survival. Knox refused to leave the unstable ground. Ivy stayed beside Grace in the darkness, and Boone, the smallest of the 3, disappeared into the storm with only one command: "Find Tom." But these dogs had not always been her protectors. 10 months earlier, Grace had found all 3 as tiny puppies, locked inside filthy transport crates in an abandoned shed, without food or water. She rescued them without knowing why they had been abandoned there. Grace also had no idea that someone desperately wanted her Montana ranch. Someone had contaminated her water, cut her fences, and entered her property in the dead of night. And beneath that ranch lay a secret they were willing to bury Grace alive to protect. Every life carries a story, and every one of us deserves a place to share what lies within our hearts. You are here with Porchlight Stories, where every life is welcomed beneath the warm glow of the porch light. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another heartfelt story. Please stay with us until the very end. If today's story touches your heart, give the video a like and subscribe to support the channel. And if there is anything we could do better, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. And now, let's begin. Rain had been falling over Cedar Hollow, Montana since before sunrise on Monday, October 6, turning the shoulders of Highway 17 into dark ribbons of mud and laying a silver haze across the pine-covered hills. By 4 in the afternoon, the temperature had dropped to 43 degrees, and the clouds hung so low that the tops of the western ridges seemed to disappear into them. Grace Holloway drove through town in an aging dark green Ford pickup with both hands steady on the wheel, watching the familiar storefronts pass beneath dripping awnings. Cedar Hollow had fewer than 3,000 residents, 1 grocery store, 2 churches, a hardware store, a veterinary clinic, and enough people who remembered the Holloway family to make anonymity impossible. At 47, Grace had spent 22 years in the United States Army, most of them working around combat engineering units where mistakes involving roads, bridges, earth, and explosives could turn permanent very quickly. She stood 5'9", lean rather than delicate, with strong shoulders, weathered hands, and the controlled posture of someone who had spent half her adult life carrying equipment heavier than common sense recommended. Her dark brown hair, now threaded with gray near the temples, was tied in a low knot at the base of her neck. A thin white scar crossed the outer edge of her left eyebrow, and her gray-green eyes had a habit of studying doors, windows, and people before settling anywhere comfortably. She was not unfriendly. She was simply economical with trust. 3 weeks earlier, Grace had received the final papers transferring Holloway Ridge into her name. The 74-acre property had belonged to her uncle, Samuel Holloway, who had died the previous winter at 78. Samuel had been a tall, narrow-shouldered cattleman with sun-browned skin, a white beard he trimmed only when someone complained, and a stubborn habit of repairing machinery long after purchasing a replacement would have made better financial sense. Grace remembered him as a quiet man who disliked unnecessary questions and loved the land with an intensity he rarely showed toward people. They had not been especially close during her final years in the Army, but Samuel had never stopped sending her short Christmas cards signed with the same sentence: "The ridge is still here." Now it was hers. The farmhouse sat 6 miles north of Cedar Hollow, at the end of a gravel road that climbed through ponderosa pine and open grass. The place looked tired rather than ruined. Gray boards had faded along the southern wall. One corner of the porch leaned slightly. The barn roof needed patching, and weeds had climbed almost to the lower wire of the western pasture fence. Grace liked it immediately. A tired house made no demands beyond work. She had been there less than 4 days when a black SUV climbed the road and stopped beside the barn. The man who stepped out introduced himself as Gavin Rourke, Regional Development Director for Granite Crest Mining. Gavin was 53, tall and broad through the chest, with carefully combed salt and pepper hair and the polished appearance of a man who rarely allowed weather to touch him without permission. His charcoal coat looked expensive, his boots looked new, and his smile was courteous without being warm. He spoke softly and never rushed a sentence, a habit that made his words feel rehearsed even when they probably were not. "I'm sorry about your uncle," he said after Grace met him near the porch. "Samuel and our company had conversations over the years." "What kind?" "Access, mostly." Gavin opened a leather folder and showed her a printed map. Granite Crest owned mineral interests west of Holloway Ridge and was studying possible transportation routes for future work. The company wanted to purchase Grace's entire property. The number at the bottom of the offer was nearly 40% higher than the county assessment. Grace read it twice. "You haven't inspected the house," she said. "We're interested in the location, not the house." That usually makes land cheaper, not more expensive. For the first time, Gavin's smile changed slightly. "Efficiency has value." Grace handed the papers back. "I'm not selling." Gavin did not argue. He simply closed the folder. "Think about it. Properties like this require time, equipment, money. Your uncle knew that." "So do I." His eyes moved toward the northern slope for only a second before returning to her. "Of course." He left a business card and drove away. Grace watched the SUV disappear between the trees, then placed the card on the kitchen counter beside a box of screws. She told herself there was nothing suspicious about a mining company wanting convenient land. Companies bought access every day. High offers were sometimes cheaper than long construction projects. Suspicion was useful. Assumption was not. 2 mornings later, the well pump stopped. Grace traced the electrical line before blaming the pump itself. Near the service housing, she found a clean break in one wire. Not weather damage. Not an animal chewing through insulation. The copper had been cut. She repaired it, photographed the damage, and wrote down the time. The following day, she found nearly 30 feet of northern fence lying in the grass. One post had rotted naturally, but the wire beside it had been severed in 2 places with something sharper than rust. Grace photographed that too. By Friday afternoon, she had created a notebook labeled Holloway Ridge in block letters and entered every unusual event by date. She still did not call Gavin. On Saturday, rain returned. Shortly after 7 that evening, Grace pulled on a faded army field jacket, waterproof boots, and a headlamp before walking toward the northern fence. Wind pushed cold rain sideways through the trees. She wanted to check whether the temporary repair was holding before darkness settled completely. The fence was intact. But near the old service road beyond the pasture, Grace noticed tire impressions cutting through wet soil. Fresh. She followed the prints only as far as her property line, then stopped. 20 yards away stood an abandoned utility shed she remembered from childhood. A low wooden structure once used by crews maintaining the old road. Its roof sagged in the middle, and one door hung crooked from a rusted hinge. Grace almost turned back. Then she heard something. A faint sound beneath the rain. Not wind, not a branch. A whine. Grace crossed toward the shed, keeping her flashlight low. The door resisted before opening with a wet scrape. Inside were 3 transport crates. For several seconds, Grace simply stared. 3 German Shepherd puppies, no more than 9 weeks old, were huddled behind the metal doors. Their fur was dirty, their water containers nearly empty. The largest puppy, a black and tan male with unusually broad paws, sat upright despite trembling from the cold. He watched Grace without barking. Beside him, a smaller female with a darker face had pressed herself into the rear corner, her brown eyes following every movement. In the 3rd crate, the smallest male stood with one ear upright and the other folding slightly at the tip. He pushed his nose through the bars, backed away, then came forward again as though curiosity and caution were fighting over the same body. "Oh, hell," Grace whispered. There was no food in the shed, no note, no vehicle. She checked the puppies for obvious bleeding or severe injury before moving anything. Then she carried the crates, one at a time, through the rain to her pickup, securing each inside the covered truck bed so they could not slide during the drive. Cedar Hollow Veterinary Clinic was technically closed, but the emergency number connected Grace to Dr. Natalie Brooks. Natalie arrived 20 minutes later, wearing jeans beneath a navy raincoat, her curly auburn hair pulled into an untidy ponytail. At 41, she was a compact, energetic woman with warm brown eyes and the quick hands of someone accustomed to frightened animals. She had grown up outside Bozeman and had spent 14 years treating everything from house cats to ranch horses. Her friendliness was practical rather than sentimental. She spoke gently to animals and directly to people. "They're cold and mildly dehydrated," Natalie said after examining the first puppy. "Underweight too, but not dangerously. Whoever left them didn't leave them there very long." "Can you tell how long?" "No, and I'm not going to pretend I can." Grace liked her immediately for that answer. Natalie found no microchips. The puppies appeared to be litter mates and were roughly 9 weeks old. "You keeping them?" she asked. "No." Natalie glanced at the smallest male, who had begun chewing the corner of a folded towel. "Very convincing. I found them 3 hours ago. People have made worse decisions faster." Grace arranged to pay for their examinations and asked Natalie to contact local rescues the next morning. For the next 3 days, however, the puppies remained temporarily at Holloway Ridge, while Natalie searched for appropriate placements. The largest male quickly developed a habit of sitting beside the porch and watching everything before moving. Grace named him Knox, because calling him the big one was becoming ridiculous. The female took longer to approach. She followed Grace with her eyes, rarely pushing forward for attention. But whenever Grace left the room, she quietly relocated somewhere she could see the doorway. Grace called her Ivy. The smallest male became Boone after stealing one of Grace's work gloves and dragging it beneath the kitchen table. He was bright, restless, and completely incapable of pretending innocence while the stolen object remained between his paws. The folded tip of his right ear bounced whenever he ran. On the third evening, Natalie called with 2 possible placements. Grace listened. Then she looked through the kitchen doorway. Knox was asleep near the front door. Ivy lay beneath the window. Boone had somehow acquired the glove again. "I'll call you tomorrow," Grace said. She never did. The following morning, Grace drove into Cedar Hollow for 3 collars, additional bowls, puppy food, and enough fencing panels to create a temporary secure yard beside the house. When she returned, she parked near the northern pasture and noticed a flash of orange among the wet grass. Grace walked toward it. A survey stake had been driven into the soil. She checked the fence behind her. The stake stood nearly 60 feet inside Holloway Ridge. Black lettering had been printed along one side. GCM South Access 4. Grace crouched and touched the wet plastic marker. GCM. Granite Crest Mining. She looked toward the northern trees, then back at the house, where 3 young German shepherds were waiting behind the temporary fence. Gavin Rourke had asked permission to buy her land. He had never asked permission to survey it. So why had Granite Crest already begun marking a route through Holloway Ridge before Grace ever agreed to sell? By the second week of October, the rain over Cedar Hollow had thinned into cold morning mist, leaving Holloway Ridge smelling of wet pine, mud, and freshly cut lumber. Grace Holloway had stopped thinking of the farmhouse as abandoned, though calling it repaired would still have been generous. The western porch support had been reinforced, 2 broken window latches replaced, and the worst leak above the kitchen temporarily sealed with roofing cement. Every finished job seemed to reveal another one. Grace did not complain. Work gave the day a shape she understood. It asked for measurements, patience, and enough humility to admit when the first attempt had been wrong. The 3 puppies adjusted faster than the house did. Knox had claimed the space beside the front door. At roughly 10 weeks old now, the broad-pawed German Shepherd male already carried himself with a seriousness that seemed unreasonable for an animal still capable of tripping over his own legs. You watched Grace move through the house, and rarely followed unless she disappeared from sight for too long. Ivy behaved differently. She remained several feet away whenever Grace sat down, but somehow appeared in every room Grace entered. If Grace worked in the kitchen, Ivy settled beneath the table. If Grace repaired a window, Ivy lay near the doorway. She did not ask to be touched. She simply kept account of where Grace was. Boone considered ownership a philosophical question. On Monday, Grace lost a glove. On Tuesday, a cleaning rag vanished. Wednesday morning, she crawled beneath the porch and discovered both items beside one of her socks, a pine cone, a length of baling twine, and a wooden spoon she had not realized was missing. Boone stood beside her with his right ear folded at the tip and his tail wagging. Grace held up the spoon. "This isn't yours." Boone sneezed. "That argument won't hold up in court." He grabbed the rag and ran. The laugh that escaped Grace surprised her more than the theft. She had been chasing Boone around the side of the house when an old red Chevrolet pickup climbed the gravel road. Its hood had faded almost pink, and one rear fender had been replaced with a darker panel that had never been painted to match. The truck stopped near the barn. The driver climbed out slowly. Tom Callahan was 66, a stocky man with a wide chest, thick forearms, and a slight stiffness in his right knee that became more noticeable in cold weather. His gray hair had retreated almost entirely from the top of his head, leaving a rough horseshoe around the sides, and a trimmed white beard covered a jaw that seemed permanently set against foolishness. He wore brown work trousers, a faded denim shirt beneath a canvas jacket, and boots darkened by years of grease and mud. Tom had spent 34 years working for the county road department, the last 12 as a road supervisor. His wife Ellen had died from cancer 6 years earlier. People in Cedar Hollow said Tom had become quieter after that, but not bitter. He simply stopped wasting words on things that did not matter. Grace met him halfway between the house and truck. "Grace Holloway?" "Depends," Tom nodded once. Samuel used to answer questions like that. "You knew him?" "Long enough to owe him 3 fence posts and $20. Did he collect?" "Fence posts, yes. $20, no. He preferred having something to complain about." Tom looked past her toward the porch, where Boone had appeared with Grace's glove again. "That one yours?" "Apparently everything is his." Tom's mouth twitched. He had brought a hydraulic jack, a box of galvanized bolts, and a heavy post driver. Grace stared into the truck bed. "I didn't ask for equipment." "No. I can handle the repairs. I expect so." "Then why bring all this?" Tom lifted the post driver out and set it beside the driveway. "Because Samuel's old north fence was already leaning when I still had more hair than judgment." Grace folded her arms. "I don't take charity." "Good, neither do I." Tom placed the jack beside the post driver. "You return them when you're finished." "I already have a jack. Then return mine immediately and enjoy the moral victory." Grace looked at him. Tom looked back. Boone ran between them carrying the glove. Tom watched him disappear beneath the porch. "You may want to solve that problem first." Grace kept the jack. Tom began visiting every few days, never announcing that he intended to help. Sometimes he brought hardware. Once he brought a stack of used boards left over from repairing his own hay shed. Another morning, Grace found a box of plumbing fittings sitting beside the porch before sunrise, with a note written in block letters. "Some of these should fit, the others are your problem." Grace would have resented the intrusion from almost anyone else. Tom made assistance difficult to reject because he behaved as though nothing meaningful had happened. Together they straightened 2 sections of fence and replaced a warped barn door. Grace noticed Tom never tried to take over. If she knew how to do something, he let her do it. If he saw a problem, he pointed at it once. His restraint made his advice easier to hear. The strange incidents continued. On Thursday morning, Grace found the shutoff valve beside the livestock line partially loosened. The connection had begun leaking during the night, turning the soil beneath it into mud. She tightened it, then studied the metal. No corrosion, no cracked fitting. Someone had backed it off. 2 days later, the repaired well pump wire failed again. This time, Grace stripped back the insulation and examined the break carefully. The copper strands were compressed and cleanly severed. Tool marks. She photographed them beside a ruler before replacing the section. Sunday morning brought another problem. The northern pasture gate stood open. Grace stopped 20 feet away. She remembered locking it. Not vaguely, she remembered sliding the steel pin through the latch after carrying a roll of wire back toward the barn. She remembered pulling against the gate to check it, because years of military work had taught her that things secured without testing were merely optimistic. Now the pin lay in the grass. Knox stood beside Grace on a leash and stared through the opening. Ivy remained behind them. Boone tried to chew a fallen leaf. Grace closed the gate and wrote another entry in her notebook. October 19. North gate found open, 0610. Pin removed, no visible damage. Tom read the growing list that afternoon. You call the sheriff? Nothing's been stolen. That isn't what I asked. I need something more useful than an open gate. Tom nodded slowly. You always need proof before you trust yourself? Grace looked up. I need proof before I accuse somebody. Tom accepted the distinction. Instead of confronting Granite Crest or anyone else, Grace bought 4 motion-activated trail cameras from a hunting supply store in Cedar Hollow. She mounted one near the barn, another overlooking the well housing, a third near the northern gate, and the last facing part of the old service road without pointing beyond her property. She recorded the positions and tested each camera twice. For 3 nights they captured nothing more threatening than deer, raccoons, and Boone standing directly in front of one lens, with his nose enlarged into a pinkish blur. The 4th night changed that. At 2:17 a.m., Grace woke to a low sound. Knocks. The puppy stood beside the bedroom door, body unusually still. He was not barking. His ears angled toward the northern side of the house, while a restrained growl vibrated in his chest. Grace sat up. Ivy lifted her head from the rug near the bed. Boone remained asleep beneath a chair, paws twitching. Grace listened. At first, nothing. Then an engine. Low, distant, moving slowly. Grace did not turn on the exterior lights. She checked that the doors were locked, then watched through a narrow gap beside the curtain. Between the trees, a faint pair of headlights moved along the old service road. The lights stopped, then disappeared. The engine continued. Whoever was driving had turned the headlights off. Grace stayed inside. By sunrise, the vehicle was gone. She retrieved the camera card. The footage was grainy but clear enough. At 2:18 a.m., a dark pickup entered the frame, traveling slowly toward the northern woods. Mud covered the rear plate badly enough that the characters could not be read. The truck continued for 6 seconds. Then its headlights went black. It disappeared toward the old road. Tom arrived just after 9. Grace showed him the video. He watched it twice. That road shouldn't carry traffic. You know it? Used to. Tom sat back in the kitchen chair. Black Pine Access Road. County maintained the first mile when I started working roads. Mine company handled the rest. What mine? Tom looked at her. Black Pine. Grace had heard the name as a child, but remembered little beyond adults warning children not to wander near old mining property. How long has it been closed? Long enough that nobody should be driving there at 2 in the morning. The following day, Grace went to the Cedar Hollow County Records Annex, a squat brick building beside the courthouse. Behind the land record counter sat Margaret Bell, a 71-year-old clerk with short silver curls, narrow red glasses, and the patient but watchful expression of a woman who had spent 40 years correcting people who believed maps changed because they argued with them. Margaret remembered Samuel Holloway and required no explanation beyond Grace's parcel number before pulling old transportation files. The newest county map showed no road crossing the northern section of Holloway Ridge. Grace asked for older versions. Margaret returned with a rolled map dated 1994. There it was. A narrow line crossed north toward a rectangular area marked Black Pine Mine Access. Grace compared it with the current map. The line had vanished. "When was this removed?" Grace asked. Margaret checked the file index. 1997. Formal abandonment after mine closure. County maintenance ended earlier. Meaning? Meaning legally it stopped being a county road. No maintenance, no public access obligation. Black Pine Mine? Closed in the mid-90s, at least according to what we have here. Grace stared at the old line, a road that officially had not existed for almost 30 years, a mine that was supposed to be abandoned. Yet a truck had driven toward it in darkness less than 48 hours earlier and switched off its headlights before entering the woods. Grace copied the relevant map pages and drove home beneath a low gray sky. At Holloway Ridge, Knox was waiting beside the porch. Grace stood at the northern fence with the old map folded beneath one arm and looked toward the trees. Somewhere beyond them lay a road the county no longer recognized and a mine that had supposedly been silent for 3 decades. But somebody still knew exactly how to get there, and Grace wanted to know why. 8 months changed Holloway Ridge in ways Grace Holloway had not expected. By early June, Cedar Hollow had traded October rain for long Montana mornings washed in pale gold, cool enough at sunrise for Grace to wear a canvas jacket, but warm enough by afternoon for the pine resin to perfume the air. Grass covered the southern pasture again, the barn roof no longer leaked, and the farmhouse windows stood open most evenings. The old road north remained quiet in daylight, though Grace had never forgotten the dark pickup her trail camera had recorded, disappearing toward Black Pine Mine. Nothing similar had appeared afterward. She kept the cameras running, recorded dates in her notebook, and resisted the temptation to turn uncertainty into certainty. Knox, Ivy, and Boone were no longer the trembling 9-week-old puppies Grace had carried out of the abandoned shed. At nearly 11 months, Knox had grown into the largest of the 3. A powerful black and tan male with a broad chest, heavy paws, and ears that stood high whenever something unfamiliar entered his world. The serious expression he had possessed as a puppy had somehow grown with him. Knox rarely wasted movement. He would watch a gate swing twice before deciding whether it mattered, and study a stranger for several seconds before relaxing. Ivy had become a leaner, darker female, with a fine black mask around intelligent brown eyes. She remained sensitive to noise and change, but the frightened puppy who once hid in the rear of her crate had been replaced by a dog who preferred caution over retreat. She still followed Grace from room to room without demanding attention, settling wherever she could keep her in sight. Boone remained Boone. He was slightly smaller than Knox, athletic, amber-faced, with the tip of his right ear still folding forward whenever he ran. He had matured physically without developing any respect for personal property. Grace had recovered gloves from beneath the porch, a hammer rag from the hay shed, and one of Tom Callahan's wool socks from behind the woodpile. Tom claimed the theft proved Boone had excellent taste. Grace claimed it proved Tom needed better socks. Grace trained the dogs almost every morning before breakfast. She did not attempt to turn them into military animals or pretend instincts could replace judgment. The commands were simple because simple things were useful under pressure. Come, stay, leave it, boundary. She taught them not to cross the main gates without permission and rewarded them for alerting to unfamiliar people without charging forward. Tom became part of another exercise. Grace would hold Boone or Ivy near the barn, while Tom walked 50 yards toward the lower pasture. "Find Tom," she would say, then release one dog. At first, Boone ran in a large, unnecessary circle before reaching him. Knox usually traveled directly. Ivy hesitated until she understood that finding Tom ended with praise rather than separation from Grace. Over time, all 3 learned the game. Grace considered it useful if one day she fell, dropped a tool in the lower field, or needed to send a dog toward a familiar person. Nothing heroic, just another practical habit. The farm itself had begun growing around them. In late May, Grace decided Holloway Ridge was finally ready for livestock. Tom advised her to start small. Grace reminded him that 6 sheep qualified as small. Tom said that depended entirely on how committed the sheep were to making poor decisions. The seller was Harold Jensen, 59, owner of a modest sheep farm 18 miles east of Cedar Hollow. Harold was a tall, sunburned man with sandy gray hair, long hands, and the patient expression of someone who had spent 35 years waiting for animals to do the opposite of what he wanted. A childhood injury had left his left foot turned slightly outward, giving him a rolling walk, but he moved around his animals with remarkable ease. He sold Grace 6 healthy yearling ewes, 4 white-faced crosses, and 2 smaller black-faced animals, after asking more questions about her fencing than about her money. Grace respected that. "You want names?" Harold asked as they loaded the last ewe. "Do sheep care?" "No." "Then neither do I." Tom leaned against the trailer. "Give it a week." He was right. Within 6 days, the largest white ewe had become Martha because she had developed the habit of complaining whenever breakfast was 30 seconds late. A smaller black-faced ewe became Pepper, after discovering exactly how much trouble could be created by squeezing her head through places the rest of her body could not follow. Introducing the dogs to the sheep provided Holloway Ridge with its first genuine comedy. Grace kept all 3 German shepherds on long lines outside the holding pen, while the sheep explored their new enclosure. Knox stared through the wire with intense concentration until Martha approached him directly. The large shepherd took 1 step backward. Martha advanced. Knox took another. Tom folded his arms. "Your guardian appears to be withdrawing. He's creating distance. He's creating a lot of it." Ivy stayed beside Grace's knee and watched the flock without moving. Boone bounced twice at the sight of Pepper trotting along the fence, clearly convinced something exciting was about to happen. Then Pepper walked straight toward him and pushed her nose between the wire squares. Boone froze. Pepper sniffed him. Boone retreated so quickly that he stepped on his own long line, stumbled sideways, recovered, and immediately looked toward Grace as though hoping nobody had witnessed it. Tom laughed loud enough to startle Martha. Grace lasted another 2 seconds before joining him. Progress came slowly. Grace rewarded calm observation, stopped the sessions before excitement became chasing, and never left the dogs alone with the sheep. Knox learned quickest. Ivy needed more time but eventually rested outside the pen while the sheep fed. Boone discovered that sheep were less entertaining once he understood he was forbidden to race them. The routine altered Grace as much as the animals. She began driving into Cedar Hollow without arranging her errands for times when stores were nearly empty. At Miller Feed and Supply, she discussed mineral blocks with employees instead of buying what she needed and leaving immediately. She accepted coffee on Tom's porch twice. Natalie Brooks stopped by one Saturday to check the dog's growth and vaccinations and ended up staying long enough to drink iced tea while Boone tried to steal the pen from her shirt pocket. Grace still valued silence, but it no longer meant absence. Holloway Ridge now carried ordinary sounds. Sheep calling at feeding time, claws on porch boards, Tom's pickup climbing the road, Boone being told to drop something he absolutely intended to keep. Then Ivy stopped drinking from the northern trough. Grace first noticed it on a hot Tuesday afternoon. Knox and Boone drank after training. Ivy approached, lowered her muzzle, then abruptly lifted her head. She sniffed the surface twice and stepped backward. Grace emptied the trough, scrubbed it, and refilled it. Ivy refused again. The next morning, the same thing happened. Grace crouched beside the water and smelled it herself. At first she noticed nothing. Then, beneath the ordinary mineral smell of well water, came something faintly metallic. She filled 2 sterile sample bottles purchased in town and sent them to a regional laboratory in Helena. The report arrived 4 days later. The sulfate level was substantially higher than previous household records Grace had found. Manganese and iron were elevated as well. None of the numbers alone explained the source, and the laboratory did not identify a specific contaminant responsible for them. The recommendation was simpler: discontinue use for livestock until the water source could be investigated further. Grace closed the northern line that afternoon and supplied the sheep from the southern well connection. Tom read the report at her kitchen table. "Could be old mineral deposits," he said. Could be. Could be something moving through groundwater. Could be. He looked over the paper. You hate that answer. I hate answers that pretend to know more than the evidence. 2 days later, Boone gave them something else. He returned from a supervised walk near the northern fence carrying a strip of mud-covered reflective tape. Grace ordered him to drop it. Boone obeyed with obvious disappointment. She rinsed the tape beneath an outdoor faucet. Part of a printed logo emerged from the dirt. A dark mountain outline. Beneath it, 3 surviving letters. GRA. Grace had seen the same design on Gavin Rourke's documents, granite crest. The tape itself proved almost nothing. Wind could carry debris. Workers could lose things miles from where they belonged. Grace and Tom walked the inside of the northern boundary the next morning. They did not cross the property line or follow the abandoned road into restricted land. Near a muddy depression beyond the old fence, however, they found fresh tire tracks. Wide commercial tread. 2 vehicles, possibly more. The tracks angled through the trees in the same direction as the road shown on the old county map. Toward Black Pine Mine. Tom stood with both hands resting on his hips. Somebody's using it. Grace photographed the prints. That's what we know. And granite crest tape is lying nearby. That's what we know too. Tom glanced at her. You ever get tired of saying that? Yes. That night the temperature dropped unexpectedly. Grace closed the kitchen windows shortly after 10 and sat at the table reviewing the laboratory report once more. Ivy lay near her chair. Boone slept upside down against the cabinet, one front leg stretched into the air. Knox rested near the front door. At 10:43 p.m., Knox raised his head. Grace noticed because he did not immediately stand. His ears angled forward. Then he rose slowly. The fur along his shoulders remained flat, but his entire body had gone still. What is it? Knox looked toward the northern wall. A second later, Grace felt something beneath her boots. A vibration. Not a truck on the road. Not thunder. The floor moved with a low, brief tremor that seemed to travel through the foundation rather than across the air. A ceramic coffee cup on the table slid perhaps an inch and stopped. Ivy sprang to her feet. Boone rolled upright and stared around the room. Then everything became still. Grace remained seated for several seconds, listening. No explosion followed. No second vibration. Outside, the sheep had begun calling nervously from the barn. Grace walked onto the porch with all 3 dogs behind the closed screen door. The night over Holloway Ridge was clear and cold. Stars hung above the pines. No machinery was visible. No headlights moved along the road. Knox stood inside the doorway, staring north, the same direction as Black Pine Mine. Grace looked toward the black line of trees and remembered the road that no longer existed, the fresh tire tracks, the granite crest tape, and now the water that Ivy would not drink. Black Pine had supposedly been dead for almost 30 years, but something beneath Holloway Ridge had just moved. The tremor beneath Holloway Ridge lasted only a few seconds. But Grace Holloway did not sleep again that night. By sunrise, a thin band of June fog had settled between the pines north of the farmhouse, and the temperature hovered near 50 degrees. The sky above Cedar Hollow was pale and cloudless, deceptively calm after the strange movement beneath the house. Grace walked the property with Knox on a long lead, while Ivy and Boone remained inside the fenced yard. She found no fresh cracks around the foundation, no fallen trees, and no obvious landslide along the northern slope. The sheep had settled again. Martha was already demanding breakfast as if the earth itself had not moved beneath her hooves 6 hours earlier. Grace appreciated the normality of it, but she did not mistake normal appearances for safety. Years in Army engineering had taught her that some of the most dangerous structural problems began where nobody could see them. After feeding the animals, Grace went into the small rear bedroom Samuel had once used as an office. She had avoided sorting most of his possessions because every drawer seemed to contain another version of a man she had known only in pieces. Behind an old filing cabinet sat a cedar chest covered in dust. Grace remembered it from childhood. Samuel had kept property records there, along with maps, receipts, handwritten notes, and anything he considered too important to trust to someone else's filing system. The brass latch resisted before finally opening with a dry click. Inside were tax statements, veterinary bills from decades earlier, fencing diagrams, old aerial photographs, and folded survey maps tied with cotton cord. Near the bottom, beneath a stack of mineral rights correspondence, Grace found a large engineering drawing printed on yellowing paper. Black Pine Mine appeared across the upper corner. Grace carried the drawing to the kitchen table and spread it flat beneath 2 coffee mugs. Knox settled near the front door. Ivy lay beneath the table close enough that Grace could feel her breathing against one boot. Boone attempted to steal the cotton cord from the documents until Grace confiscated it and placed it on top of the refrigerator. The map showed more than the mine entrance Grace remembered hearing about as a child. Black Pine had once been a network of tunnels, ventilation shafts, drainage channels, and maintenance passages stretching beneath much of the northern ridge. Several workings ended west of the Holloway property, others did not. One narrow line labeled North Service Drift crossed directly beneath the northern portion of Holloway Ridge before connecting with an older drainage route. Grace checked the modern parcel map. The line passed under land she now owned. A smaller notebook lay beside the drawings. Its dark leather cover had cracked with age, and Samuel's handwriting filled the pages in thick, square letters. Most entries were ordinary ranch notes: fencing repairs, rainfall totals, livestock losses, equipment problems. Then Grace found a page dated 19 years earlier. One sentence had been underlined twice. Never reopen the north line. Water follows it. Grace read it 3 times. There was no explanation beneath it. She called Tom. His red Chevrolet arrived 40 minutes later. Tom climbed the porch carrying his usual steel thermos and found Grace surrounded by maps. "You look like Samuel when the county changed a drainage boundary without telling him," he said. "Was that bad?" "He attended 3 meetings in 1 week. For Samuel, that was practically a declaration of war." Grace pointed to the mine drawing. Tom's humor disappeared. He removed his glasses from his shirt pocket and leaned over the table. He knew Black Pine had extended near Samuel's property, but had never seen the complete underground layout. When Grace showed him the note about the north line, Tom remained silent for several seconds. "Samuel ever mention this to you?" Grace asked. "Not directly." "That means indirectly." Tom sat down. He had fights with mining companies going back years, not fistfights. Samuel would have considered lawyers more painful anyway. Tom explained that Black Pine had changed ownership several times before closing. Even after active mining ended, companies occasionally approached Samuel seeking temporary access across Holloway Ridge for surveys, equipment, or geological studies. Samuel refused most of them. His argument was always the same. The northern ground contained old workings, the drainage was unreliable, and allowing heavy equipment across it created risks nobody wanted to accept once something went wrong. "Granite Crest?" Grace asked. "They came later. I know Samuel had words with somebody representing them maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Don't know exactly what about." Grace looked down at the old map. Tom tapped the northern service drift. If Samuel wrote that warning, he had a reason. Reasons aren't evidence. No. I need to know what Granite Crest actually wants. That afternoon, Grace began working through public property records, state mining permits, county transportation plans, and corporate filings available online. What initially looked like scattered paperwork slowly became a recognizable picture. Granite Crest controlled mineral rights and leases on a large tract west of Holloway Ridge. A recently approved exploration area sat farther beyond the mountain, separated from the existing county road by rough ground and a seasonal creek. A transportation proposal filed 2 years earlier showed a planned route approaching from the west. The route was almost 9 miles long and required construction of a small bridge capable of carrying heavy equipment. Grace measured the distance on the county map. From the existing service road, across Holloway Ridge to Granite Crest's new area was barely more than 2 miles. She sat back. The 40% premium Gavin Rourke had offered suddenly looked less generous. Granite Crest was not paying extra because Holloway Ridge was valuable as a ranch. It was valuable because it was in the way. A direct route could eliminate miles of road construction, a bridge, months of permitting, and years of maintenance costs. Tom studied Grace's calculations when she showed him the next morning. They'd save a fortune. Yes. Enough to explain the offer? Yes. Enough to explain somebody cutting your fence? Grace closed the folder. No. Tom nodded. He understood immediately. A motive was not proof. Granite Crest had a financial reason to want Holloway Ridge. That did not prove anyone from the company had cut the pump wire, opened gates, driven toward Black Pine at night, contaminated the water, or placed the survey stake inside Grace's boundary. Grace added everything to the notebook and kept working. For almost a week, nothing happened. That quiet made the event on Thursday night more unsettling. At 1:36 a.m., the sheep began screaming. Grace woke instantly. Knox was already standing. Ivy moved toward the bedroom door. Boone scrambled upright so quickly that his back feet slipped on the floorboards. Grace pulled on boots, took a flashlight, and clipped leads to the dogs before stepping outside. The southern holding pen was secure. The western pasture was not. 6 sheep moved in scattered confusion near the driveway. The outer gate stood open. Grace swept the flashlight across it. The chain hung loose. The padlock lay in the mud. Its shackle had been cut cleanly. "Martha!" The large ewe turned toward Grace's voice, but another sheep moved toward the road. Grace brought Knox forward, keeping him on a long line. He did not know how to herd properly, but months of boundary work had taught him to move where Grace directed. She positioned him between the sheep and the driveway. Knox stood alert, his presence alone encouraging 2 ewes to turn back toward the pasture. Ivy worked from Grace's other side. She remained several yards away from the flock, matching Grace's movement without rushing them. Boone initially bounced with excitement until Grace gave him a sharp stay command. Then she pointed toward the open gate. "Boone, gate!" It was an exercise they had practiced during training. Boone ran toward the opening and stopped near the inside boundary, creating another visible obstacle rather than chasing the sheep. Pepper approached Boone. Boone briefly looked as though he remembered every humiliation of their first introduction, but this time he held his position. Tom arrived 15 minutes later after Grace called him. Together they returned the final ewe to the enclosure and secured the gate with a spare chain. Tom picked up the damaged lock. "Bolt cutters," he said. Grace took it from him. Deep, symmetrical marks dented the steel. This was not a forgotten latch. Someone had deliberately opened the pasture. By 4 in the morning, the animals were secure. Grace photographed the lock and gate before going inside. Knox collapsed near the door. Boone drank half a bowl of water and fell asleep against a cabinet. Ivy remained beside Grace while she entered the incident into her notebook. Grace finally slept for less than 2 hours. At 6:40 a.m., she opened the front door and nearly stepped on an envelope. No stamp, no address. Her name was not written on it. Grace did not immediately touch it. She photographed the envelope where it lay, then picked it up by one corner and carried it to the kitchen table. Inside was a single, photocopied map of Holloway Ridge. The northern section had been circled heavily in red ink. Grace stared at the markings, then she saw the message beneath them. "Sell before the ground does it for you." She read the sentence slowly. Tom stood beside the window, looking toward the northern trees. Knox had risen from the door and was watching the same direction. Grace placed Samuel's old mine map beside the photocopy. The red circle covered almost exactly the area crossed by the old North Service drift. Her first thought was obvious. Someone wanted to frighten her into selling. But another possibility followed. Samuel had written, "Never reopen the North Line, water follows it." The well chemistry had changed. Fresh vehicles were using the abandoned road. The ground had vibrated beneath the farmhouse. And whoever had delivered this map knew enough to circle the land above the old mine workings. Grace looked past the porch toward the dark pines covering the northern slope. For the first time, she was no longer certain the message was only a threat. What if someone wasn't warning Grace to sell because they wanted her land? What if someone was warning her because they knew what was happening underneath it? Grace did not spend the morning trying to guess who had left the envelope. By 8:30, she was already driving into Cedar Hollow with the photocopied map sealed inside a plastic evidence sleeve she had improvised from an old document protector. The sky had turned overcast again, and a cool June wind pushed low clouds across the valley. Rain had not started, but the air carried the metallic smell that usually came before it. Knox, Ivy, and Boone remained at Holloway Ridge, inside the secured yard with the sheep moved temporarily into the southern pasture. Grace had checked every lock twice before leaving. The Cedar Hollow Sheriff's Office occupied a low brick building beside the volunteer fire station. Sheriff Daniel Mercer met Grace in a narrow interview room that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Daniel was 58, tall and slightly stooped through the shoulders, with short iron-gray hair, a square face, and pale blue eyes that rarely showed surprise. He had served in the county for nearly 30 years, first as a patrol deputy and later as sheriff. Unlike men who used authority to make every room smaller, Daniel spoke quietly and listened longer than Grace expected. A deep line beside his mouth gave him a permanently tired expression, though his manner was patient rather than cynical. Grace placed the envelope, photocopied map, photographs of the cut lock, damaged pump wire, opened gate, and her incident notebook on the table. Daniel read everything before speaking. "You touched the envelope?" "Only after photographing it where I found it." "Anyone else handle the paper?" "Tom saw it, didn't touch it." Daniel nodded. "Good. You think there'll be prints?" "Maybe. Maybe rain, paper handling, or whoever made the copy gave us nothing. I don't promise miracles." "Neither do I." That earned the faintest hint of a smile. Daniel agreed that the message could reasonably be treated as intimidation, especially combined with the damaged property. But he refused to tell Grace it proved Granite Crest was responsible. "Financial motive isn't the same as evidence," he said. "That's what I've been saying." "Then keep saying it." Grace left the original envelope and map with him. She also gave him copies of the trail camera footage showing the dark pickup on the abandoned road. Her next call went to the county environmental office. Elena Ruiz arrived at Holloway Ridge that afternoon in a white utility vehicle carrying sampling cases, waterproof notebooks, and more caution tape than Grace thought one person could possibly need. Elena was 43, 5'6", compact and athletic, with warm olive skin, dark brown eyes, and thick black hair braided down the center of her back. She wore field trousers, steel-toed boots, and a faded blue county jacket with environmental services stitched over one pocket. Her father had worked irrigation systems in southern New Mexico, and Elena had grown up around wells, ditches, and arguments about where water came from and where it went. She had spent 17 years as an environmental engineer and had acquired a habit of touching nothing before photographing it. Grace liked that immediately. Elena reviewed the laboratory results at the kitchen table. "Elevated sulfate, manganese, iron," she said. "None of this proves illegal discharge. Old mine workings can affect groundwater naturally, especially after seasonal changes. So we start with what we know." Elena glanced up. "You military?" "Army engineers." "That explains the sentence." Grace showed her Samuel's old black pine map, but did not suggest entering the mine. Elena was relieved. "Do not go into those workings," she said. "I'm serious. Old timber supports rot from the inside, vent shafts collapse. Water can undermine floors that look solid enough to park a truck on." "I wasn't planning to." People say that right before they borrow a flashlight. Grace folded the map. "No flashlight." They began sampling the property systematically. Elena collected water from the southern well, northern line, livestock trough, drainage channels, and 2 small surface seeps. She labeled every bottle with time, location, and temperature before placing it in a cooler. Ivy followed Grace on a lead. Knox and Boone remained in the yard. At the northern drainage, Ivy slowed. Grace noticed because the dog had walked past the same area dozens of times. Ivy lowered her head toward a shallow ditch running between alder brush and young pines. She sniffed, moved several feet uphill, stopped, and sniffed again. Ivy. The shepherd looked back but did not return immediately. Grace shortened the lead. What's she doing? Elena asked. Something smells different. You smell it? Grace crouched near the ditch. At first, she noticed wet soil and vegetation. Then beneath it came something faint and sharp, not exactly fuel, not exactly sulfur. Yes. Elena approached from the side and knelt several feet away. I smell it too. They followed the drainage uphill without leaving Grace's property. The water itself was barely more than a thin trickle running beneath grass. About 40 yards from the fence, Ivy stopped beside a mound of fallen branches. Grace called her back. Elena photographed the area before either woman moved anything. The branches looked natural from a distance. Up close, several had been cut rather than broken. Elena put on gloves. Together they removed only enough debris to see underneath. A black industrial pipe emerged from the soil. It was nearly 4 inches in diameter. Fresh mud had been packed around part of it, and dead leaves had been spread over the exposed section. Water dripped steadily from an open outlet into the natural drainage ditch. Grace stared at it. That belong here? No. Elena's answer came immediately. You're sure? I'm the person who signs off on county discharge infrastructure in this district. She opened a tablet and checked the mapping database. No permitted outlet, no registered agricultural drainage, no approved temporary line. Grace looked uphill toward the tree line. Where does it come from? We don't know yet. Elena repeated the phrase deliberately. Grace almost smiled. She had found someone else who disliked assumptions. Elena photographed the pipe from multiple angles, took GPS coordinates, measured flow, and collected samples from both the outlet and the drainage below it. She also took swabs from the pipe exterior and documented the cut branches used to conceal it. This becomes an official investigation now, she said. What changes? I notify the State Environmental Division. They'll compare chemistry, permits, property boundaries, and industrial records. Nobody touches this pipe until we know who installed it and where it connects. Granite crest? Elena closed the sampling case. Possible, not proven. Grace nodded. That evening, Gavin Rourke called. His voice remained as smooth as it had been 8 months earlier. I understand there's been some concern regarding water on your property. Grace leaned against the kitchen counter. How did you hear that? Small towns. Elena filed something less than 4 hours ago. A pause, barely noticeable. Then Gavin continued. Granite Crest takes environmental compliance seriously. If our operations are shown to affect your property, we'll cooperate fully. That sounds rehearsed. I deal with liability for a living. So I've noticed. He shifted the conversation quickly. Granite Crest was prepared to make Grace another offer for Holloway Ridge. This time the number was almost 70% above the county assessment. Grace looked through the window at Knox lying beside the porch steps. No. Grace, you're maintaining an aging property over abandoned mine workings. You have water issues, infrastructure costs. My answer is no. You haven't heard the complete terms. I heard the part where you want my land. Gavin's tone remained polite. I hope you reconsider before the situation becomes more expensive for everyone. The line went quiet. Grace lowered the phone slowly. She wrote the time and exact wording in her notebook. At 11:48 that night, Knox stood up. Grace was reading at the kitchen table when the shepherd moved from the hallway toward the back door. Ivy lifted her head instantly. Boone continued sleeping near the couch. Knox did not bark. He stared toward the barn. Then Grace heard it. A metallic click. Pause. Another.
The sound came from the equipment shed. Grace turned off the kitchen lamp and looked through the side window. No vehicle. No obvious flashlight. Another scrape came from outside. She did not reach for a coat. She did not open the door.
Instead, Grace locked the rear entrance, checked the front deadbolt, turned on every exterior floodlight at once, and called Sheriff Mercer. The yard exploded into white light. A shadow moved near the shed. Someone ran. Grace saw only part of a figure between the barn and fence, dark jacket, average height, moving quickly toward the northern trees. Knox barked once. Grace kept him inside. "Stay!" He remained at the door, trembling with restrained energy. By the time Daniel and a deputy arrived 12 minutes later, the intruder was gone. The shed lock showed fresh scratches but had not been opened. A set of muddy footprints crossed part of the yard before disappearing into rocky ground. Daniel photographed everything. "You did the right thing staying inside." "I know. That wasn't praise. It was encouragement to do it again." Grace almost told him she did not need encouragement. Instead, she said, "Fine." At sunrise, Boone became interested in a bush near the eastern fence. Grace was checking the sheep when he began circling the same patch of wet grass. He pushed his muzzle beneath the lower branches, backed out, then shoved himself in farther. "Boone, leave it." He ignored her. Grace approached. Boone emerged carrying something rectangular in his mouth. "Drop." He did. A plastic identification badge fell into the mud. Grace picked it up with a gloved hand. The photograph showed a man with short brown hair, a heavy jaw, and a narrow expression. The printed information beneath it was unmistakable. Wes Calder Granite Crest Field Operations. Grace knew the name from corporate documents. Wes Calder was 39, Granite Crest's field operations manager, responsible for crews, equipment movement, and site access around the Cedar Hollow project. She had never met him in person. Daniel arrived again 20 minutes later. He sealed the badge in an evidence bag. Grace looked toward the equipment shed, then toward the northern trees where the intruder had disappeared. A concealed industrial pipe had been found on her property that morning. Gavin Rourke had offered even more money that afternoon. Someone had entered Holloway Ridge before midnight. And now the identification badge of Granite Crest's field operations manager had been found inside her fence. Grace had wanted evidence. For the first time, she had something that could not be explained away as an old road, drifting debris, or coincidence. But one question mattered more than the badge itself. Why had Wes Calder's identification card been lying on Holloway Ridge immediately after someone tried to enter her shed? By late June, the investigation around Holloway Ridge had moved beyond suspicion and into paperwork, laboratory reports, and official questions. Elena Ruiz returned to the property on a humid Tuesday morning with a sealed folder under one arm and a look Grace had already learned to recognize. Elena did not exaggerate bad news. That made her silences more meaningful than most people's speeches. The latest water analysis showed that the unusual discharge contained a chemical pattern consistent with drainage moving through old mining material. Elevated sulfate, iron, and manganese appeared alongside mineral traces matching samples taken closer to the abandoned black pine workings. Elena was careful with every word. The results did not yet prove who had installed the hidden pipe, and they did not prove Granite Crest had ordered anything illegal. But they did establish that the water entering Holloway Ridge was connected to disturbed mining ground rather than ordinary agricultural runoff. The County Environmental Office opened a formal investigation and referred part of the matter to the state. Granite Crest responded within hours. The company released a short statement denying authorized involvement with any unregistered discharge line. Gavin Rourke claimed the discovery of Wes Calder's identification badge suggested that Wes might have acted independently or entered the property without company approval. Then Wes disappeared. He failed to report to Granite Crest the next morning. His company phone went directly to voicemail. By evening, it had been turned off entirely. Sheriff Daniel Mercer told Grace only that investigators were trying to locate him and that she should not interpret his disappearance as an admission of guilt. Grace understood. But a shape had begun forming from the scattered pieces. Someone had used the abandoned black pine system. Someone had installed an unregistered pipe leading water toward Holloway Ridge. Someone had damaged Grace's property repeatedly, while Granite Crest kept raising its offer to buy the land. If a group inside the company could make the ranch expensive, unreliable, and frightening enough to own, Grace might eventually decide that selling was easier than fighting. It was a theory, a strong one, but Grace still did not have evidence that Gavin Rourke had personally ordered any of it. That missing link bothered her because she understood organizations. Orders did not always come written as crimes. Sometimes they arrived as pressure, deadlines, phrases like, "solve the problem" or "make this go away," leaving someone lower in the chain to decide how far to go. Grace continued documenting everything while waiting for the investigation to move. Then the weather changed. On Friday afternoon, the National Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm warning for the Cedar Hollow area. A slow-moving summer system had formed west of the mountains, carrying strong winds, heavy rainfall, and the possibility of flash flooding along steep ground. Grace took the warning seriously. By 4 o'clock, the western sky had turned almost purple. Wind bent the grass across Holloway Ridge in long waves, while pine branches hissed overhead. Grace moved all 6 sheep from the open pasture into the reinforced southern holding area beside the barn. Among them was Maisie, the youngest ewe Grace had purchased 2 months earlier, after Harold Jensen called to say he had one additional animal available. Maisie was barely 9 months old, smaller than the older ewes, with thick, cream-colored fleece, a narrow white face, and a dark smudge around her left eye that made her look permanently surprised. Unlike Martha, who protested every change loudly, Maisie was nervous and easily startled. Grace had learned that sudden noises sent her toward whatever opening looked farthest from the sound. That made storms a problem. Grace checked every gate twice. Tom Callahan drove up shortly before sunset, carrying extra batteries, 2 fuel cans, and enough concern to disguise as irritation. "You planning to sleep tonight?" he asked. If the weather allows it, the weather didn't ask. Together they cleared leaves from the drainage ditch south of the barn, tied down loose equipment, and moved emergency supplies into the farmhouse. Grace placed a handheld radio, flashlight, rope, first aid kit, and waterproof jacket beside the back door. Tom looked toward the northern slope. "You call if anything shifts." "I know. Before you investigate it." Grace gave him a look. Tom pointed one thick finger at her. "That look is exactly why I said it." He left before dark so he could secure his own property. The storm arrived just after 10. Rain struck the roof hard enough to drown out the television. Wind drove water beneath the porch and rattled the barn doors despite the new latches. Knox paced between the kitchen and back entrance. Ivy stayed near Grace's chair, her body tense whenever thunder rolled across the valley. Boone initially tried to watch the rain through the window until one violent crack of thunder sent him backward from the glass. Grace checked the sheep every 20 minutes. At 11:37, they were dry and secure. At 11:58, the southern drainage was still carrying water properly. At 12:19, Grace was pulling on her rain jacket for another inspection when a sharp crack sounded outside. Not thunder. Wood. A second later came a heavy crash. The dogs exploded into barking. Grace clipped all 3 onto leads before opening the door. A large pine had fallen across the auxiliary fence near the sheep enclosure. The trunk had missed the barn, but several branches crushed a section of wire and twisted the smaller gate outward. Grace swept her flashlight across the pen. Martha, Pepper, 1, 2, 3 more shapes. 5. Grace counted again. 5. "Maisie!" A frightened bleat answered somewhere beyond the damaged fence. Then silence. Grace secured the remaining sheep inside the inner stall and closed the reinforced gate. She did not release the dogs, despite the rain and darkness. Knox, Ivy, and Boone remained attached to separate leads while Grace searched around the fallen tree. A patch of cream-colored wool clung to broken wire. Maisie had slipped through the gap. The hoofprints were already filling with rainwater. Grace called Tom. No signal. She tried again and managed to send a text. Maisie loose, searching north of barn. I'll check in within 10 minutes. The message showed delivered after several seconds. Grace fitted her headlamp, looped a coil of rope across one shoulder, and put the handheld radio into her jacket pocket. Close. The dogs moved with her. Boone lowered his nose near the damaged gate and followed the strongest trail. Grace did not treat him like a tracking dog. She simply watched where his attention went and compared it with the visible marks left in the mud. The trail curved toward the northern drainage. Grace's stomach tightened. Rain streamed down her face as she led the dogs along the higher ground. Maisie's tracks appeared intermittently in soft soil, then disappeared over gravel. Knox slowed. 20 yards ahead, the ground looked normal. Wet grass, dark soil, a few exposed roots. Knox stopped completely. Grace gave a gentle forward cue. He took one step and stopped again. His head lowered. His weight shifted backward. Grace remembered the tremor beneath the farmhouse, the old mine maps, the warning in Samuel's notebook. She did not force him forward. Back! Grace moved all 3 dogs several yards uphill. 3 seconds later, the section Knox had refused to cross sank with a soft, sickening sound. It did not collapse into a dramatic hole. The ground simply dropped several inches, then another foot, exposing roots beneath the grass. Grace stared at it. Knox stared back. Good boy. She led the dogs around the depression using firmer ground. Minutes later, a frightened bleat came through the rain. Maisie. Grace followed the sound toward an old stone-lined depression marked on Samuel's map as a ventilation area. Most of it had been filled decades earlier, but stormwater had cut away part of the covering soil. Maisie stood on a narrow shelf below the upper slope. She was alive, but trapped. Water streamed beside her hooves into a dark opening partially covered by old timbers. Grace secured Knox and Boone to a mature pine well uphill from the damaged ground. Ivy remained on a shorter line beside her. She tested the tree, then tied one end of her rope around its trunk and clipped the other through her work belt as an improvised safety line. Stay. Grace approached slowly. Maisie bleated again. I see you. The ewe tried to turn. Loose soil slid beneath one rear hoof. Grace stopped. Easy. She lowered herself, spreading her weight. Ivy remained behind her, trembling but quiet. Grace reached forward, almost close enough. Then the earth beneath her left knee cracked. Grace froze. A dark line raced across the mud. The ground dropped. She slid before she could stand. The safety rope caught hard around her waist, slowing the fall, but wet soil carried her down several feet into a partially collapsed underground chamber. Ivy came with her, her lead snagging briefly before sliding free around loose soil. Grace struck the wall shoulder first. Something heavy rolled from above. A rotten timber dropped across her left leg and pinned it between the ankle and calf. Pain flashed white through her body. Grace stopped moving. Ivy! The shepherd scrambled through mud toward her. I'm here! Grace forced herself to breathe evenly. She checked her head. No blood. Arms working. Right leg free. Left boot straight, but trapped. Maisie stood several feet away, on a separate shelf of earth, shaking violently. Above the opening, Knox barked. Boone answered. Rain poured through the broken ground. Grace reached for her radio. County emergency. This is Grace Holloway at the north ventilation area of Black Pine. I'm trapped below surface level. Static. She tried again. Nothing. The surrounding rocks swallowed the signal. Grace checked her phone. No service. Water trickled past her trapped boot. Ivy pressed against her shoulder. Grace looked upward. Knox's head appeared briefly above the edge. Beside him stood Boone, rain flattening his amber fur and his folded ear against his skull. For months, Find Tom had been a harmless exercise. A game across a field. A biscuit at the end. Now Tom's house was almost a mile away. Downhill through dark woods, heavy rain, and a road partially blocked by storm debris. Grace looked at Boone. She had spent 22 years believing preparation existed to keep moments like this from happening. Now preparation meant trusting what she had taught a dog who once considered socks a legitimate form of currency. Grace reached upward and unclipped Boone's lead from the anchor line. "Boone?" The young German shepherd stared down. "Find Tom." Boone did not move. Grace pointed toward the southern trail. "Find Tom." For one long second he remained at the edge. Then Boone turned. His shape disappeared into the rain. Grace listened until even the sound of his movement vanished beneath the storm. There was no guarantee he understood. No guarantee Tom would be home. No guarantee the trail remained passable. Grace rested one hand against Ivy's wet fur while cold water continued collecting around her trapped leg. For the first time since returning to Cedar Hollow, she could do nothing except wait and trust someone else to find the way back to her. And that someone was the smallest dog she had once rescued from a filthy crate in the rain. Boone ran downhill through rain so heavy that the familiar road seemed to vanish beneath his paws. Water streamed along the tire ruts. Loose stones rolled beneath him, and every flash of lightning turned the pines white for an instant before darkness swallowed them again. The young German shepherd had traveled this route dozens of times beside Grace or while following Tom Callahan's battered red pickup from inside the fence. But never alone, and never in weather like this. He did not know that Grace was trapped beneath an abandoned mine, or that water was gathering around her pinned leg. He knew only the command she had repeated in training for months. Find Tom. The main road curved south through the trees. Boone followed it until a fallen pine blocked the entire width. Its upper branches had buried the ditch, leaving no easy passage beneath them. Boone stopped, shook rain from his face, and paced along the trunk. For several seconds he appeared uncertain. Then he turned away from the road and pushed through wet brush toward a narrower trail. Tom sometimes used that path when he walked up Holloway Ridge instead of driving. Boone had followed his scent there before, usually because Tom carried dog biscuits in the right pocket of his canvas jacket. Grace had laughed that Boone would someday navigate the entire county by snacks. Tonight, the memory mattered. Boone slipped once on the steep ground, rolled against a patch of ferns, regained his feet, and continued downhill. Nearly a mile away, Tom Callahan stood in his kitchen staring at his phone. Grace's earlier message remained on the screen. Maisie loose, searching north of barn. I'll check in within 10 minutes. 23 minutes had passed. Tom had already tried calling twice, no answer. He was reaching for his rain jacket when something struck the front door. Scratch, scratch, then barking. Tom opened it. Boone stood on the porch soaked to the skin, chest heaving, muddy water dripping from his belly. The folded tip of his right ear lay flat against his head. He barked once, spun toward the yard, ran several yards into the rain, then stopped and looked back. Tom's expression changed immediately. "Where's Grace?" Boone barked again. Tom did not grab a rope and follow him blindly. He had spent too many years working county roads to mistake urgency for a plan. He called 911 first. "Possible collapse at Holloway Ridge," he told the dispatcher. "Old Black Pine mine workings under the north slope. One person unaccounted for, possibly below grade. Ground has already shown subsidence. Heavy rain still active." He gave the safest approach route, explained the fallen tree blocking the main road, and warned that the abandoned mine maps showed ventilation workings beneath the northern property. Then he took a headlamp, emergency blanket, handheld radio, and first aid bag. "Show me." Boone was already moving. Below the hill, Grace Holloway measured time by the cold. Water had risen enough to surround the sole of her left boot. The rotten timber still pinned her lower leg against the sloping ground. Every attempt to shift her weight caused loose dirt to trickle from the wall beside her, so she had stopped trying. Maisie remained stranded on the opposite shelf, trembling but upright. Ivy lay against Grace's right side. The German shepherd did nothing miraculous. She did not understand fractures or hypothermia. She could not move the timber or call for help. She simply refused to go farther than the length of her lead. Whenever Grace became too still, Ivy lifted her head and pressed her wet nose against Grace's hand. Grace flexed her fingers. "I'm awake." Ivy remained there. Above them, Knox barked periodically, not constantly. One bark, silence, then another. Grace recognized the pattern. Knox was responding to something outside the hole. But without sight of the surface, she could not know what. Then a voice carried through the rain. "Grace!" "Tom." Grace shut her eyes for 1 second. "Below the vent!" Tom appeared at the upper edge but stopped well back from it. "You hurt?" "Left leg pinned. Ivy and Maisie are down here. Knox is above. Ground is unstable." "Boone found me." Grace looked toward the darkness beyond the opening, where the smallest dog had disappeared. "He actually did it. He also tried to outrun me uphill." For the first time since the collapse, Grace almost laughed. Within minutes, distant engines became audible from the eastern service route. Tom had guided the dispatcher toward an old county maintenance approach that avoided the fallen pine. Red and white emergency lights flickered through the trees. The rescue team moved carefully rather than dramatically. Leading them was Captain Rachel Hayes, 46, a county technical rescue officer with 16 years of experience in confined spaces, flooded culverts, unstable slopes, and abandoned industrial sites. Rachel was a compact woman just over 5'5", with a strong square build, dark blonde hair braided beneath a red helmet, and gray eyes that seemed to become calmer as everyone else became more worried. A faded burn scar crossed the back of her left hand from an early career warehouse rescue. And since that accident, she had become almost stubborn about redundant safety systems. She spoke in short sentences and never stepped onto questionable ground simply because someone else had already survived standing there. Her team stopped well uphill. "No one approaches the edge until we establish the stable zone," Rachel ordered. Tom showed her Samuel's mind map on his phone, which Grace had photographed months earlier. Knox remained tied to the pine above the collapse. He had stopped barking now that people had arrived, but his attention stayed fixed on the opening. A rescue technician named Miguel Santos began assessing a possible anchor point along the eastern side. Miguel was 34, tall and wiry, with a narrow black beard and a calm, methodical manner developed during 10 years working mountain and industrial rescues. He wore a yellow helmet, waterproof harness, and mud-covered boots. He tested the ground in front of him before shifting his weight. He took one step toward a patch of apparently solid grass. Knox rose sharply. A low growl came from the shepherd's chest. Miguel paused. Knox pulled backward against his lead. "Hold," Tom said. Miguel did. 3 seconds later, the ground in front of his right boot cracked. A slab of wet earth slid inward and disappeared into the collapsed vent. No one moved for several seconds. Rachel pointed south. "Move the eastern anchor 6 feet back. We're not trusting the surface." Tom crouched beside Knox and placed one hand against his shoulder. "Good enough, boy." No one called Knox supernatural. The dog may have felt movement, heard cracking roots, or simply sensed something the humans had missed. What mattered was that Miguel had stopped. The team established 2 independent rope anchors uphill. Once Rachel was satisfied, Miguel was lowered toward Grace in a full-body rescue harness. He reached the chamber and assessed her first. "Grace Holloway?" "Yes." "Any loss of consciousness?" "No." "Neck pain?" "No." "Left leg pinned below the knee, shoulder hit the wall." Miguel checked circulation in Grace's foot before examining the timber. Then Maisie bleated. Miguel turned his head. "That ours too?" "Unfortunately." Grace still had the U partly secured with a length of rope she had managed to loop across its chest after the collapse. "Animal first," Grace said. Miguel looked at her. "You sure? If Maisie panics while you're moving the timber, we get another problem." He nodded. A wider webbing loop was lowered from above. Miguel worked it beneath Maisie's chest without forcing the U toward the edge. The frightened animal resisted until the line gradually took her weight. Slow lift, Miguel called. Maisie rose from the shelf, swung briefly against the muddy slope, then disappeared upward. Tom's voice followed. She's out. Ivy stood. Miguel clipped a rescue lead to her collar. Come on. Ivy did not move. She returned to Grace and pressed her body against Grace's shoulder. Ivy? The dog looked at her. Grace touched the wet fur between her ears. Go. Ivy hesitated. That's an order. Only then did she step toward Miguel. The team raised Ivy carefully to the surface. Grace watched until the dog disappeared. Something inside her tightened more painfully than the trapped leg. Miguel noticed. She'll be waiting. I know. Freeing Grace required more time. The timber could not simply be pulled away, because part of it supported loose debris. The team lowered an inflatable lifting bag and a small stabilization brace. Miguel positioned both while Grace remained secured to an independent rope. Pressure coming off your leg, he said. The lifting bag expanded slowly. The timber rose perhaps 2 inches. Enough. Miguel cut away a section of Grace's torn trouser leg, caught beneath a splinter, then guided her ankle free. Pain surged through her calf. Move your toes. Grace did. Again. All 5 responded. Good. They secured the leg and raised Grace through the opening. Rain struck her face before she saw anything else, then lights, hands, Tom, and 3 dogs. Ivy reached the stretcher first and pressed herself beside it. Boone planted his muddy front paws against the frame until Tom pulled him gently down. Knox remained near the anchor line, still watching the dark ground. Grace extended one hand from beneath the emergency blanket. Ivy touched it first. Boone next. Knox. The large shepherd finally turned from the collapse and came toward her. Grace ran her fingers once across his wet forehead. All 3, she whispered. Tom understood. All 3. Grace was being prepared for transport when the northern wall of the opening shifted again. A section of earth collapsed inward. Rachel ordered everyone farther uphill, but the movement exposed something beneath the broken timber. Not old mining equipment. New equipment. A length of black industrial pipe ran through the old passage. Beside it sat a compact submersible pump connected to electrical cable that looked far newer than anything Black Pine had contained 30 years ago. A waterproof data unit had been mounted against a surviving timber support. Rachel immediately stopped anyone from touching it. Sheriff Daniel Mercer and Elena Ruiz were notified. By dawn, the collapse had become both a rescue scene and a protected investigation site. Grace spent the following hours at the Cedar Hollow Medical Center with a badly sprained ankle, deep bruising and mild hypothermia, but no broken bones. Later that afternoon, Daniel visited. The equipment was documented in place, he told her. Serial number on the pump came back to an industrial supply order. Grace looked at him. Granite Crest? Daniel nodded. 2 days later, investigators obtained warrants based on the pipe, pump records, environmental findings, and previous evidence from Holloway Ridge. The searches produced internal correspondence involving Wes Calder and Gavin Rourke. One email instructed Wes to maintain the south line during a period of heavy water accumulation. Another message from Gavin contained the phrase, "Increase acquisition pressure regarding Holloway Ridge." Neither sentence alone described sabotage. Together with everything else, they changed the investigation. Then Elena brought Grace a printed planning document recovered from the same records. Near the bottom of the page was a heading. Phase 2, Cedar Hollow Watershed. Grace stopped reading. Holloway Ridge had been one property, one well, one family's land. But Cedar Hollow's watershed stretched far beyond her 74 acres. Grace looked through the hospital window toward the mountains hidden behind summer clouds. For months, she had believed someone wanted her ranch. Now she wondered whether her ranch had only been standing in the way of something much larger. And if Phase 2 had gone forward, how many other families in Cedar Hollow might never have known what was moving beneath their water? The investigation into Granite Crest did not end when Grace Holloway left the Cedar Hollow Medical Center. In many ways, that was when it truly began. By the time she was discharged 3 days after the collapse, her left ankle was wrapped in a rigid brace, bruising covered one hip and shoulder, and she had strict instructions not to put full weight on the leg until the swelling subsided. Grace disliked every part of those instructions. She disliked the crutches, the slow movement, and especially the fact that Tom Callahan was waiting outside the hospital with her pickup because Sheriff Daniel Mercer had refused to let her drive herself home. Tom looked at the brace, looked at Grace, and wisely avoided smiling. "Not one word," she warned. "Wasn't planning on it." "You were thinking one." "Several." For once, Grace did not argue when he took her bag. While she recovered, state environmental investigators widened the inquiry beyond Holloway Ridge. The pipe exposed inside Black Pine Mine, the pump purchased through Granite Crest, the hidden discharge outlet, and the emails referring to the South Line were no longer separate incidents. Investigators compared equipment logs, vehicle records, employee schedules, water treatment reports, and internal communications from the previous 18 months. The picture that emerged was smaller than a company-wide conspiracy, but more deliberate than Granite Crest had first admitted. 6 days after Grace returned home, Wes Calder surrendered himself through an attorney. Wes was 39, broad-shouldered and thick through the neck, with close-cropped brown hair, a square jaw, and deep shadows beneath his eyes that made him appear older than the photograph on the identification badge Boone had found. He had spent most of his adult life around heavy equipment and mining crews, rising from machinery operator to field operations manager because he solved problems quickly and rarely questioned deadlines. According to Daniel, Wes had the personality of a man who had built his value around being useful to people above him. When those people demanded more than he could safely deliver, he had continued saying yes until there was nowhere left to stand. His cooperation changed the case. Wes admitted that Granite Crest had faced serious delays because water had begun entering parts of its exploration area faster than the approved treatment system could handle. Building additional treatment capacity would have slowed the project and increased costs. Gavin Rourke never sent an email saying, "Dump contaminated water into Holloway Ridge." He was too careful for that. Instead, Wes described repeated meetings in which Gavin insisted that production schedules could not slip, told field managers to use existing infrastructure, and demanded that the drainage problem disappear before investors reviewed the next quarterly report. The existing infrastructure was Black Pine. A small group of field employees reopened part of the abandoned South Line, installed pumps and temporary piping, and redirected water through old workings toward the northern drainage above Holloway Ridge. None of it was properly reported. At first, according to Wes, Grace's property had only been viewed as a convenient route. Then Grace refused to sell. Again. And again. That was when the pressure changed. The unauthorized survey stake had been placed to mark a proposed access line before Granite Crest owned the land. The damaged pump wiring, loosened water valve, cut fencing, opened gate, and late-night trespassing had been intended to make Holloway Ridge increasingly expensive and exhausting to maintain. Wes admitted participating in some acts and knowing about others. The goal was not to physically harm Grace. It was to make her conclude that the ranch was more trouble than it was worth. The statement did not make Grace feel better. Intent mattered in court. Consequences mattered everywhere else. One night a cut gate had sent frightened sheep toward a road. Another night a storm and unstable ground had nearly buried Grace, Ivy, and Maisie beneath Black Pine. Wes also confirmed that Gavin knew the South Line was operating. That testimony alone might not have been enough. Other Granite Crest employees began talking. One was a 32-year-old environmental technician named Lauren Pike, a thin, freckled woman with short blonde hair and a nervous habit of twisting the ring on her right thumb whenever she spoke. Lauren had objected internally after seeing water volumes that did not match the company's official treatment records. She had saved copies of reports after being told the discrepancy would be corrected later. Another employee, maintenance foreman Marcus Hill, 51, a heavy-set former diesel mechanic with a shaved head and a reputation for saying exactly what he thought, provided equipment logs showing company vehicles making nighttime trips toward Black Pine. Neither Lauren nor Marcus had known about the vandalism at Holloway Ridge. That distinction mattered. Granite Crest was not an army of villains protecting one secret. Most employees had simply been doing ordinary jobs inside a company where a few people with authority had decided deadlines mattered more than rules. Once investigators showed them what had happened, several workers cooperated. The evidence accumulated quickly. Gavin Rourke was eventually charged in connection with environmental violations, conspiracy to conceal unauthorized discharge, criminal trespass, property damage, and falsification or concealment of operational records. Wes faced charges as well, though his cooperation was taken into account. Granite Crest's regional operations around Cedar Hollow were suspended, while state and federal agencies reviewed the contamination and required a remediation plan. Pumps were removed from Black Pine under supervision. The concealed discharge route was closed. Monitoring wells were installed around the old mine and along Holloway Ridge. The northern portion of Grace's property remained fenced off permanently. A state geologist told her the ground there might never be considered suitable for livestock or heavy vehicles again. Grace accepted that more easily than she expected. Some land did not need to be conquered simply because you owned it. Samuel had understood that. Never reopen the North Line. Water follows it. The old man had left a warning, and decades later it had finally been heard. Grace's recovery took longer than her patience. For the first 2 weeks, Tom handled most of the sheep. Martha complained about the arrangement from the moment he arrived each morning. Pepper attempted to escape through a gate Tom had not yet finished opening. Maisie, apparently recovered from her underground adventure, became suspicious of puddles for almost a month. Knox developed a routine of lying near the front gate facing the road into Cedar Hollow. He did not whine or pace, he simply watched. Ivy slept beside Grace's old Army field jacket whenever Grace traveled into town for medical appointments. Tom once moved the jacket onto a chair so he could sweep the floor. Ivy picked it up, carried it back down, and lay on it again. Tom never tried moving it twice. Boone showed less emotional dignity. Within 3 days, he stole Tom's work glove. Within 6, he took a wool cap. The following week, Tom discovered one bootlace missing from a pair he had left beside the porch. "He's processing trauma," Grace said from her chair. Tom stared at her. "With my clothing, everyone heals differently." Boone walked past carrying the glove again. For the first time in years, Holloway Ridge contained laughter almost every day. Natalie Brooks continued checking the dogs and livestock during Grace's recovery, usually insisting the visit was professional, even when she arrived carrying sandwiches. Daniel stopped by occasionally with updates on the case. Elena monitored the water results and eventually confirmed that the southern supply remained safe, while the northern system stayed disconnected. Grace began noticing something she had spent years refusing to name. People came back. Tom came back, Natalie came back, Daniel and Elena came back. Knox, Ivy, and Boone waited when she left and celebrated when she returned. For 22 years in the Army, Grace had learned to live out of duffel bags, temporary quarters, deployments, rotations, and places where saying goodbye before becoming attached seemed like efficiency. Holloway Ridge taught her another form of discipline: staying. By autumn, Grace could walk without the brace. Through winter, she rebuilt the southern pasture and converted an unused section of the barn into 3 secure kennels. She began working with a regional rescue organization that occasionally received abandoned working breeds: German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, cattle dogs, and mixes whose energy or instincts had overwhelmed previous owners. Grace did not create a grand sanctuary. She started with one dog, then another. Dogs stayed temporarily while Natalie handled medical care, and Grace worked on basic routines, boundaries, trust, and calm behavior before appropriate homes were found. Tom installed the first kennel gate while loudly insisting he had no intention of becoming involved. 3 months later, he had his own jar of dog treats in the barn. The following June, nearly a year after the Black Pine collapse, Grace carried a long cedar board down to the entrance road. The afternoon was warm and bright. Grass moved along the hillside beneath a clean Montana sky. 6 sheep grazed safely in the southern pasture. 2 foster dogs rested inside shaded kennels near the barn. Tom held the wooden sign upright while Grace tightened the bolts. Natalie stood nearby with lemonade. Knox watched from the gate. Ivy sat beside Grace's truck. Boone had disappeared. "That worries me," Tom said. "What?" "I can see 2 dogs." Grace looked around. A moment later, Boone emerged from behind the pickup, carrying Tom's canvas hat. "There he is. I'm too old for this. You keep leaving things where he can reach them." "It was on my head." Grace laughed. Then they stepped back from the sign. Across the cedar board, Grace had carved 3 Guardians Farm. Beneath it, in smaller letters, "No one left behind." Grace rested one hand on the top of the post. Almost a year earlier, she had opened the door of an abandoned shed during a cold Montana rain and found 3 frightened puppies locked inside transport crates. She had not rescued them because she expected loyalty in return. She had not imagined Knox would one day sense unstable ground before a rescue technician stepped onto it. She had not imagined Ivy would lie beside her underground while cold water gathered around her trapped leg. She had certainly never imagined Boone, the puppy who stole gloves and considered socks treasure, would run through a storm to find the one man Grace had finally learned to trust. Grace had simply seen 3 living creatures that needed help. So she helped. For most of her adult life, Grace believed strength meant being the person who could carry the most weight without asking anyone else to touch it. The Army had taught her endurance. Holloway Ridge taught her something harder. Sometimes courage meant trusting the rope someone else lowered. Sometimes it meant sending a dog away because he had a better chance of finding help than you did. Sometimes it meant letting a stubborn old neighbor carry your bag home from the hospital. Grace looked toward Tom. He was trying to trade Boone a biscuit for his hat. The negotiation was going badly. She looked at Ivy, then Knox, then the open farmhouse door beyond them. The place she had once chosen because she wanted to disappear had become a place where lives arrived to be found. Grace had saved 3 puppies from the rain. In return, they had not repaid a debt. Love was not accounting. They had simply grown beside her until the day came when each of them knew, in his or her own way, how to stay. Grace touched the words carved beneath the farm's new name. No one left behind. She had once understood those words as a soldier. Now she understood them as something more. If someday we lose the road home, perhaps grace does not always arrive as a miracle from the sky. Sometimes it has 4 paws, waits beside us in the dark, or runs through the storm until someone hears it coming. The greatest lesson from Grace and her 3 dogs is that kindness is never wasted. Grace rescued Knox, Ivy, and Boone when they were small, frightened puppies with nothing to give her in return. She did not save them because she expected a reward. She simply saw 3 lives that needed help and chose to do what was right. Months later, when Grace could no longer save herself, each of those dogs became part of the miracle that brought her home. Sometimes God answers our prayers in ways we never expect. A miracle does not always come with thunder from heaven. Sometimes it comes through a loyal dog that refuses to leave our side. Sometimes it comes through a neighbor who keeps showing up, even when we insist we need no one. Sometimes it begins with one small act of kindness that seems meaningless at the time, but returns years later when we need hope the most. In everyday life, we may never face a collapsing mine or run through a storm searching for someone we love. But all of us meet people and animals who need compassion, patience, or a helping hand. We may never know how far one good deed will travel. We may never see the lives it changes, but that does not make the kindness any less important. Perhaps that is one of the quiet ways God works in this world. He places lives in our path and gives us the choice to care for them. And sometimes the ones we thought we were saving become the ones who lead us back toward hope. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that love and loyalty still exist in this world. Tell us in the comments which moment between Grace, Knox, Ivy, and Boone touched you the most. And if you believe God can send unexpected guardians into our lives, comment Amen below. Please subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories about animals, loyalty, second chances, and the quiet miracles that can change a life. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home, guide you through every storm, and place faithful hearts beside you whenever the road becomes difficult. And may you always remember that no act of kindness given with love is ever truly lost.